Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's premier citizens forum. We're delighted you're with us today. I'm Don Williams, president of City Club. Our speakers today are state economists Tom Potiowsky and Randy Pozdena, senior economists from ECONorthwest. Their topic, the economy and the City Club's annual economic forecast. For the benefit of our radio and television audiences, please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. First, a few announcements. Join us for our next Friday forum on January 11th, the race for the presidency. Our panel will include Lewis and Clark professor Robert Eisinger and Lisa Grove, political consultant and strategist. Rod Gramer, executive director of KGW Northwest News, will be the moderator. Doors open at 11:15, and we'd like you to come early next week, and that's because it'll allow you to hear the debate and vote on the City Club's research report on Oregon's initiative and referendum system. The debate will begin at noon. The research committee will also answer questions at a town hall meeting on Wednesday, January 9th at the City Club Commons starting at 5:15. Please RSVP to Kim at the City Club office. Making reservations for Friday forums just became a lot easier. Members and non-members alike now can reserve luncheon tickets online weeks in advance and also for multiple programs. In addition, the new system will also help the check-in process on Fridays. Deadlines for reservations and cancellations still remain the same Wednesday prior to the program at 2 o'clock. We've also made it easier for you to register by phone, and you can still certainly do that if you don't want to do it online. In 1909, Jefferson High School was hailed as one of the most advanced high schools in the nation. Almost 100 years later, Mayor Tom Potter is inviting the Portland community through the school's front doors for his annual State of the City address. On Friday, January 18th, Mayor Potter will deliver his annual address in the Jefferson High Auditorium. Doors open at 11:30 and the program will start at 12:15. There'll be no lunch service, but refreshments will be available for purchase. Reserved seats are $5 and general admission will be available at the door for no charge. Please make your reservations early by phone or online. Please join me in welcoming our new City Club members. We have 5 today, and they will stand. Please hold your applause until all are introduced. First, Vinnie Martin, school psychologist, Northwest Regional Education Services District. Les Carney, who's retired and a volunteer. Veronica Renard, Director of Community Relations at POVA. Caleb Winter, who's a transportation planner. And Melody Thompson, founder of Financial Beginnings. Thank you for joining City Club. Welcome. Economics. In 1849, Victorian historian Thomas Carlyle described economics as the dismal science. You might be inclined to ask, why then would City Club want to start a fresh new year with a topic many view as somewhat negative? Well, there's a number of good reasons. First, it's a tradition. City Club has offered this program for many years, and your response, today included, has always been very good. You enjoy the experts' predictions on the stock market, interest rates, and key economic indicators. In fact, Tom Potiowsky has been a panelist in the program for the last 8 years, and we keep asking him back. Secondly, it's relevant and timely for all Oregonians, and the third reason is our speakers are noted experts in the field. They're also interesting and entertaining. Both are motivated by the fact that a Google search on the topic economist jokes yielded over 84,000 hits. Dr. Tom Potiowsky received his economics degree from Ohio University. Both of his graduate's degrees were earned at the University of Colorado. After teaching at Colorado, he joined the faculty at Portland State University, and at PSU, he was chair of the economics department. Tom then served as the Oregon State economist for 7 years until 2006. He directed the Office of Economic Analysis, and this is the agency that's responsible for analyzing data and forecasting tax revenues for state budget planning. In 2006, he returned to Portland State to teach economics and develop an economic and business center at the university. Now, it's interesting to note that not only does the City Club ask Tom back, but so does the state of Oregon. He returned to his previous position as state economist just last week, and he's on leave from Portland State and still plans to keep his affiliation with the university. Like his fellow speaker, Tom has published numerous articles. Those of you who want some good late-night reading can read one of his most interesting, which was published in 1995, and the title is Adjustment Mechanisms of the Basic Classical and Keynesian Models. Dr. Potiowsky also has strong civic ties. He serves on the board for the Oregon Council on Economic Education and the Oregon Progress Board. Dr. Randy Pozdena is the managing director at ECONorthwest, a consulting firm specializing in economics consulting services and expert testimony. He leads the firm's quantitative analysis practice. ECONorthwest is the largest independent economics consulting firm in the Northwest. Prior to his current position, he was vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and also a senior economist at SRI International. He's nationally recognized in applied economics and banking and securities markets. Like Tom, he has written many articles, over 50 published papers and books. Randy also taught economics and finance at UCal Berkeley Graduate School. It's rumored that he once advised his students considering the field of economics. It's not easy being an economist. How would you like to go through life pretending you knew what M1 was all about? He also has a wonderful commitment to public service and has served on numerous civic boards. These includes having served as chair of the Oregon Economic Council and a Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. He graduated from Dartmouth and received his master's and doctoral degrees at UCal Berkeley. Randy also consulted for 2 years in Sweden and told me he's probably the only United States economist who can forecast in the Swedish language. He promised not to do that today. And finally, I should advise you that given his expertise in mathematics, Randy offered to do a comprehensive variance analysis on all of Tom's past economics forecasts at City Club. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to complete that task before today's program. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you, Don. This is my third day back on the job. I went through the turbulence days of the early 2000s, and I left the Office of Economic Analysis as the risk of recession in the country and Oregon was quite low. Now, I return with the risks rising and analysts daring to mention the R word. Let me unequivocally state that what we have here is a classic case of spurious correlation. In other words, the state of the economy and my return as state economist is pure coincidence. But the economy we have today is not an accident of nature. It's a result of financial wizardry, too good to be true money-making schemes, and an insatiable appetite for economic growth and political world that sends raw resources reeling, forcing the speaker into shameless use of alliteration. That's how bad it is. Of course, being a good economist, that is just one side of the story. The economy has shown amazing resilience. Unemployment is still relatively low. Inflation is under 3%, and we still have positive job growth. Slowdown is not the same as recession, and we will weather this storm to see better times in 2009. Well, the truth is always harder to find than the lie. Whether we are headed for recession or a soft patch in growth is not a yes or no answer. So let me briefly attempt to sift through some trends for the national economy and thus in turn facing the Oregon economy. Now, there is no question that both the national and Oregon economies have slowed down. Although the growth of GDP for the U.S. came in at 4.9% for the third quarter of 2007, the trends in job growth and unemployment do not reflect this. December employment gains were only 18,000, and unemployment rate rose to 5% from 4.4% a year ago. Thus, expectations for the fourth quarter of GDP growth will be much lower as advanced numbers are released at the end of this month, January 30th. Oregon's unemployment growth also slowed considerably in the third quarter of 2007, posting the first decline in jobs at 0.3%, the first quarterly decline in 16 consecutive quarters. Oregon's seasonally adjusted unemployment rate stands at 5.5% for November 2007, not much different than the 5.4% rate in November of 2006. So what are the major causes for this economic slowdown? And will these continue to cause a slowdown as we go forward this year? Two major problems facing the economy have been around now for the last 2 years: housing and energy. And let me first take up the housing first. When you have 45-year low mortgage rates coupled with a crippled stock market, where do you go to invest? With first-time home buyers, current home owners trading up, joined by speculators, the demand for single-family housing and condo ownership was tremendous. But while places like Florida, Nevada, Arizona, and California were seeing a rapid rise of prices, Oregon was a bit slow to join this party. Two metro areas in Oregon, though, did experience price appreciation a bit early and larger than the rest of Oregon, specifically Medford and Bend. Now, while Oregon did see house price appreciation, our experience has been less dramatic than other hot places to live, and we are seeing a softer landing during this housing correction. I say this for Oregon as a whole. Situations are a bit harsher in Medford and Bend. Keep in mind that for the housing market to grow so quickly, you need to have a lot of resources devoted to this growth. Resources in the form of lumber and wood, construction workers, financial specialists, landscape engineers, real estate agents. Once these new homes and condos are built, you need to fill them with furniture and appliances. At this high level, housing activity starts to come down, the same level of resources are no longer needed. In Oregon, lumber and wood products is suffering, with prices for their products down over 50%, mill demand and closures, lost jobs. Financial activities is feeling the effect of waning demand for mortgages. Real estate selling is once again a skilled job. And it's much too late to sell your stock in Home Depot or Lowe's. Construction employment in Oregon had been racing along at double-digit growth for the past couple of years. Now it's almost flat and would be negative if it wasn't for commercial construction and public works. So now, what is the extent of this housing downturn and its impact on the coming year in Oregon? Interestingly enough, Oregon was rather conservative in its lending practices, with rather a small number of subprime mortgages relative to other places in the country. Foreclosures are up, but still not to the proportion seen elsewhere. On the other hand, Oregonians tended to take out more adjustable rate mortgages. So you might say that we are a bit more credit worthy in our mortgages, but we still like to gamble a bit. Given that our housing price appreciation was not as long or great compared to other hot markets, and our mortgages are relatively more credit worthy, the impact from the housing market downturn will not be as severe as related to the impact from these subprime mortgages. But make no mistake about it, we have more pain coming in 2008. The question is, how long and how deep will this housing downturn be? Housing is not like financial paper. It doesn't immediately adjust with a resounding thud. Housing supply is not turned off instantly, and prices can be slower to adjust. Thus, it could be early 2009 before we see a balance between demand and supply. The greater the fall in prices, the quicker the markets will balance, but the financial foreclosures will rise in their rippling effect throughout the economy. Correspondingly, for Oregon, I envision further weakness in the lumber and wood products industry, construction, financial activities, and parts of retail trade. The extent of the weakness is going to be related to the depth and duration of this housing correction. So let me briefly turn to energy. We've recently seen the price of a barrel of oil go past $100. Gas prices at the pump have almost reached inflation-adjusted prices that peaked back in May of 1981. So why are we not in the depths of a recession like we were in the 80-82 period? Well, generally, not any one single factor is the cause of recession. Recall back in the early 1980s, we were battling very high interest rates and inflation. And today's high prices are more a consequence of rapid demand growth rather than curtailments of supply. Add to this that we actually took energy conservation to heart. We need around half the energy today to support the same amount of GDP as back in the early 1980s. Now, I know this is not much comfort to you as you fill your gas tank, but prices would need to go higher before we really have a similar impact as in the early 1980s. Some analysts see gas prices around $3.50 to $7.75 a gallon to truly see consumers spending less on other goods and services. I say this in the aggregate. Lower income households are definitely hurting today. And where will the prices of oil end up at? Will they actually reach these high levels? Given all the factors and unknowns from political, technological, and available supplies, Joe at the corner tavern can guess as well as the top experts in the field. What does this mean for Oregon? The same problem facing the country as a whole. What happens to the consumer's budget? And does oil prices work its way through other prices in the economy? Basically, the oil and gasoline prices are a tax on Oregonians that don't get respent back in your community. That leaves less for spending on all other goods and services, and consequently, a slowing down of the economy. Now, so much for the fun stuff. There are some bright spots depending on your view. The value of the dollar has been declining for some time. This is not beneficial to consumers, but exporting businesses are enjoying the ride. Oregon exports saw double-digit growth in 2006 and a 7.1% increase through the third quarter of 2007 compared to a similar period in 2006. Only two sectors have seen a decline in growth: computer and electronic products and transportation equipment. Because computer electronic products constitute over 43% of the total value of exports, all other exporting sectors had to have double-digit growth to overcome the drop in computer sector in order to still have a positive growth for exports of 7.1%. If our trading partners' economy's growth stays strong, the export sector should remain a positive force for the Oregon economy and definitely helping out our manufacturing sector. Now, for those of you that have paid attention, I have yet to answer the question as to the outlook for the Oregon economy. Rather than give a prediction of, say, employment growth in 2008 will be 1.234852%, I'll talk in generalities. My old economics professor taught me that it is better to be loosely correct than precisely incorrect. The most likely outcome, not necessarily the one that will happen, always cover your bases, is for the slowdown in the Oregon economy to continue through the first half of 2008 with marginal improvements in the second half. Needed for this outcome is the settling down of the housing market and oil prices receding back to somewhere in the order of $75 a barrel. No recession, but also not painless. My biggest fear in this scenario is the housing financial problem spreading to all parts of the financial industry. Moving from more stringent credit standards to across-the-board credit restrictions would push the U.S. and Oregon economy into recession. And if oil prices and other forms of energy move through our price system, this places the Federal Reserve facing the mythical hydra. Which head to cut off, the slowing economy or inflation? A no-win situation for the Fed. So, I remain, given the current data, that Oregon will have a rough 2008, but no recession. And if we do fall into recession, do not shoot the messenger. It is pure coincidence. Thank you.
As Don pointed out to you, I am now mainly a consulting economist. We consultants are different from other people in a lot of ways. First, we write executive summaries on our love letters. Second, we understand the airline fare structure. We also refer to divorce as divestiture. And when we praise our children, we use the term value added. Tom has given you an excellent overview of the issues that face the state economy in 2008 and their national origins. What I want to do is two things. First, I want to give you some information specific to the Portland region. And second, there are some additional perspectives, not always completely aligned with Tom's, on the big influences on the economy that I want to share with you. That's the risk of inviting two economists to speak. You'll get two different opinions, and three if one of them went to Harvard. I hasten to add that my views offered here are my personal professional views, and not necessarily those of my employer, any boards or commissions upon which I serve, or family members living or dead. That disclaimer allows me to be as ornery as I want. The Portland economy. Certain things inevitably happen when you focus on a smaller rather than a larger economy. A metro economy like ours here in Portland generally exhibits more volatility than the state or national economy, let alone the global economy. Secondly, a metro economy is less diversified than a state or national economy. Those things are kind of inevitable because we're just a smaller cut of a bigger pie. Let me put some numbers to this, though, specific for our region, so you can kind of understand how we relate to the national economy. I like to say that the Portland economy is a zero alpha economy. I like to say that because no one knows what I'm talking about. What I mean, though, if you were a stockbroker, you'd know what I meant there. But what I mean by that is, were the national trends flat, were the nation doing nothing, we would also do nothing. That is to say, we don't either outperform or underperform the national economy, everything else being equal. There's not indigenous growth here that's faster than the nation, or indigenous drag on our economy less than the nation. However, the Portland economy is also what we call a high beta economy. And what that means is that when the national economy goes through business cycles, we go through exaggerated characterizations of that cycle. Over the past 3 decades, in a statistical manner, this pro-cyclical exaggeration has been on the order of about 30%, 25 to 30%, depending upon when you do your measurements. What this means is that if the U.S. economy falls out of bed by X, we'll fall out of bed by X plus 30%. We saw this most recently in the 2001 recession, when we fell faster, farther, and harder than the nation as a whole going into the recession. And when we came out, we grew at a higher rate. Of course, you kind of have to. You know, if you've fallen far, the growth rate has to be fast to get you back out of the hole. Now, this riskiness, which is what the beta is really measuring, I should have said that beta is kind of a measure of risk, comes out of generally two things: either a lack of diversity, which we've already briefly indicated is likely, or some kind of built-in inflexibility. On the first count, as a lack of diversity, it is somewhat inevitable that the Portland economy is less diversified than the national economy. However, what's interesting to me, and maybe a trend worth thinking about, is that diversification has actually been declining over time. We're becoming less diversified. And if you think about it, this kind of has to be the case because we've lost capacity in manufacturing, forest products, metals refining, finance, all of our big bank headquarters left town in the main, et cetera. So we do have a healthy economy, but it's much more concentrated in services, construction sector, and a few other sectors. It's not as diverse as it once was. Quantitatively, as Don indicated, I lead our quantitative practice, so I get kind of sweaty if I don't give you a number every so often. We're about 13% less diversified than we were in 1980. A lot of people don't know that. They think we're more diversified today than we were then. We've lost corporate headquarters, as I mentioned, and the U.S. Census says, also somewhat surprisingly, that downtown Portland employment is lower today than it was in 1997. Despite all the towers that have gone up and so forth, you'd think there'd be more people there, but that floor space is being used less intensively than the old days when the banks had what they called the back office, lots of people sitting in really uncomfortable small cubicles, writing with pens that never wrote very well. We also, on the second count, we also do not have a particularly flexible economy. And I have to say some of this inflexibility is self-inflicted, not without the best intentions, but it is nonetheless self-inflicted. We have rigid urban growth boundaries that limits the flexibility or the ability of us to flexibly supply sites to households and industries and employers. We have nationally restrictive wage and workplace regulations, employer health insurance mandates, one of the nation's highest minimum wage laws, et cetera. And starting this month, we are going to single-handedly lick the greenhouse gas problem by interventions in the state energy markets. Those are the kinds of things that, whatever the good intentions, they introduce inflexibility in our economy. And again, it's a trade-off. I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things. I'm simply saying they do introduce inflexibility. As a result of this, we don't tend to have much entrepreneurship in our region. Overall, the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Institute, who measures these things, rates Oregon as 37th out of 50 states. Now I'm flipping into Tom's ground, which is the state rather than the local. That's all I can get the data for, in terms of our entrepreneurial environment. That will affect our long-term growth. Interestingly also, you think when you file your IRS tax return, it just kind of goes into a bucket and it's never seen again, but they actually use that to measure, they use the addresses that you put on your returns to study migration patterns in the U.S. of tax-paying households. What is interesting, and maybe you're not aware of this too, is according to those statistics, our in-migrants have approximately 10% lower household incomes than our out-migrants. So we're net growing. We have more in-migrants than out-migrants, but we're generally bringing in lower-income people and exporting higher-income people. On average, over time, that's got to bring down the contribution of migration to our average income. Indigenous people, the people who stay here a long time, are the other part, make the other contribution, of course, but the contribution of migration is generally to lower wages. Now, I want to turn now to the prospects for 2008, linking some of these observations to the 2008 prospects. And I want to offer three general observations. I'm going to overlap a touch with Tom. First, because of that beta thing I was talking about, a national recession would be particularly bad for Portland, given that we have this high beta with respect to the national economy. So if the national economy goes into the tank, we're going to take a deeper dive than the national economy. So we need to know how the factors nudging us toward recessions are going to behave or evolve. Second, and some people don't think of this as an important economic event, but economists do, desperate for something to think about and lack of friends. We have a presidential election occurring next year, and there are some implications of that for how our economy might evolve in 2008, even though the election doesn't occur until the end of the year. Third, the extraordinary weakness of the dollar, that we currently are enjoying will have a material effect on the U.S. and Portland economies. Other things, immigration policy, our management of trade with China, Iraq, et cetera, are important, but I'm not going to talk about those because there's very little that we can do about them locally. So let me just offer my views on these 3 points. First, on the factors driving us toward recession. It is a mortgage-driven, it's a credit crunch recession. And this is really embarrassing because I worked for the Federal Reserve System for 13 years, and we thought we'd killed mortgage-driven recessions. We thought, that was a thing of the past. But again, with the road to hell being paved with good intentions, in the 1990s, we did certain things, the regulators did certain things to encourage what we called then deepening of mortgage credit availability. For example, Eugene Ludwig, President Clinton's comptroller of the currency, bragged in 1997 that pressure applied to mortgage lenders had resulted in loans to central cities growing at 150% of non-central cities. And that was a good thing because it was thought that the central cities were being deprived of credit. In addition, lending to low credit score households was growing at triple the rate of lending to high credit score households. That also was viewed as a good thing. Of course, these are precisely the loans that are going sour today. If you look at the default rate, they are central city and low-income household loans. Sadly, we have brought down the very people and places that we intended to help. So be careful what you wish for, you may get it. Then there was the seesaw policies of my former employer, the Fed. Again, this is where I can be ornery, and they can't fire me anymore, or at least not twice. The Fed really jerked the economy around. Go back a little bit further than some of you may remember, but if you remember Y2K, the Fed was all concerned that the world was going to come to an end, and so it injected a whole bunch of liquidity into the economy. Then Y2K turned out to be a ho-hum. They had to suck that liquidity out. Crash went the stock market. Then the Fed said, ooh, that's not good. Up went the flow of liquidity into the economy again. And we had what's called the Greenspan put, but most important to you is a very, very low short-term rates, 1% Fed funds rate for 3.5 years. And then at the end of that, they said, well, that can't be good. Let's raise it. And they raised it by 4 percentage points up to 5% or thereabouts. Now, this seesawing is not good for an economy. That lowering of the rates actually created what's called the short-long carry trade, which mortgages are part of. That is to say, you borrow cheap at the short end and you lend at a higher rate at the long end. That's what the mortgage market is. And it provided strong stimulus to the housing market and the mortgage market. And you can see this in graphs very distinctly. It's almost like a light goes on. You see home ownership rate suddenly really skyrocketing at about the time that this occurs. So I guess my point is the Fed first created, then killed this market, including the deepening element of the market and the derivative securities that Wall Street had contrived to try to spread this new credit risk that it was supposed to absorb. So although it's popular to blame Wall Street and predatory lenders, in my view, I'm a little bit more willing to spread the blame around. I think some of the feel-good policies, feel-good regulation and so forth that occurred during that time period and Fed policy deserve their share of the blame as well. No, the Fed has adequate tools to, right now we don't have the problem is not the price of credit, it's that you just can't get it. Especially if you're trying to get what's called a jumbo or non-conforming loan, or if you have a low household income, low credit score. If you're perfectly conforming, you can get credit easily today to buy a home. It's not the price, it's that you simply can't get the credit. It's called a credit crunch. The Fed, though, has tools to avoid a credit crunch, various things called the discount window, reserve requirements, and a procedure called jawboning, which means they go to the banks and say, hey, guess what, we regulate you, wink, wink, how about if you start lending a little bit more? Okay, it's called jawboning, but usually in the Federal Reserve, in the bowels of the Federal Reserve, you don't see very much in the way of people actually talking to each other. Now, the second issue I want to turn to is the presidential race, because the net effect of this, I'm concerned that I don't have a lot of confidence that the Fed is going to sort of pull us out of the mud here very quickly. So I think the net effect of this credit crunch is not going to be positive. Like Tom, I don't expect to see a recession in 2008. but it's for the following reason, not the reason I just discussed. And the following reason is that the presidential race, interestingly, I think, may have a somewhat offsetting effect. This has happened ever since, well, at least the Kennedy administration, if not before. I think the market anticipates a Democrat victory in '08 and expects some increase in the marginal tax rates levied on highest income individuals in the economy. We had a peek at this prospect when Rangel of New York proposed a 4% surcharge on high-income households and elimination of some capital gains rate preferences. That didn't pass. It was part of the alternative minimum tax reform legislation that just went through. Now, ironically, most economists believe that raising marginal tax rates ultimately is a bad thing for the economy. Now, that doesn't mean raising tax revenues, it means raising marginal tax rates. But ironically, we may enjoy what's called a false prosperity prior to that, because what would you do if you thought that rates were going to rise in, say, 2009? You'd start to earn and realize your income before then. And so in that process of trying to anticipate that effect, you may spend more, invest more, work more than you might otherwise have. And that's called false prosperity, but it's a good thing in this case because it may help counterbalance what will otherwise be a negative thing on the mortgage side. The third issue is the effect of foreign exchange rate changes. If any of you have done any traveling, you know that this has happened. It's now costs you $1.50 to buy a euro. It used to be that it only cost you 90 cents to buy a euro. If you've gone to Canada, it's now parity. They used to have a currency that you could buy with bottle tops. And this should be good for us in terms of export demand increases and therefore for our export-oriented industries. In the case of the Oregon economy, it's a little bit more mixed than that. And let me just be a little bit probably obtuse here, but first, our economy, again, is mostly non-traded sectors. Services, construction. We don't have a lot of that hardcore manufacturing stuff. We do, of course, but not as much as we used to have. So that's called a non-traded goods sector. And they will suffer relative to traded goods sectors because the traded goods sectors will be drawing resources out of those sectors in order to handle the increased export demand. And that doesn't mean within Portland. That means people will be coming to Portland to draw capital out of our economy. Second, within the traded goods sector, studies of previous exchange rate cycles suggest that the strongest areas won't necessarily be the ones where we're particularly the strongest representative in the economy. I can list all the industries if some of you are interested in a particular industry during the question and answer period. I'll be glad to tell you, but the software should benefit. A railroad rolling stock, we do have a manufacturer here in town. Steel products, transportation equipment, aerospace, and so forth should benefit. Ones that should benefit but probably won't for some other reasons are forest products, timber and logs, veneer, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into all the details. So now let me quantify the outlook for 2008. Tom didn't want to quote out the 3 decimal points, and so I won't either. I've operated a model of the Portland economy for about 25 years, and the latest run of that model suggests next year we'll have a weak first quarter. We're in that first quarter already, with some strengthening in the remaining 3 quarters, probably at least partly as a result of this anticipatory effect of the presidential race, but also some other macroeconomic effects that I won't go into. Construction and manufacturing growth will be negative over the course of the year. So if you're in those 2 sectors, you're going to see negative employment growth is a prediction of our model. And partly this is due to the fact that although our housing is very expensive relative to our incomes, but I don't expect a rout in housing prices. I don't expect our housing prices in the Portland area to fall. And it's for reasons that Tom has already talked about. We have mostly conforming mortgages in our region. We don't have a heck of a lot of subprime or what are called Alt-A type mortgages. They're really junky mortgages. This outlook assumes that the Fed, Congress, and our legislature won't do something to further spook Oregon business. I mentioned earlier on that somewhat ominously, the announcement of the Oregon greenhouse gas initiatives immediately prompted concerns from Intel and other major regional manufacturers about the effects of the mandates. And I'll close on an ornery economist's view, just to maintain my reputation as a pain in the neck. I think this concern is a real one. It is very telling. I'm not a believer that we can regulate a complex economy into prosperity or even energy conservation. So I'm weird, but I don't believe that that can happen. And I think it is telling that on this note, and you may or may not be aware of this. Since Kyoto was negotiated in 1997, emissions have increased in every one of the EU 15 nations, despite all the talk. In fact, EU 15, the 15 countries in the EU, emissions have been rising at a faster rate than US emissions have. And we're not a participant. We're supposed to be screwing up, but they're screwing up. Now, why is that? What's the mystery here? The reason is that competitive firms always have a strong incentive to reduce costs of anything. Nothing special about energy. But it's very odd that public policy, which often laments that Wall Street is always looking for ways to combine firms and fire people, get rid of labor costs, strip itself of labor costs, and so forth, somehow needs the prescient hand of regulation to get rid of energy costs. Baloney. Competition will do it if we maintain competition and if we price energy properly. We don't need a straitjacket of regulations being run by someone somewhere who knows less about your needs for energy or my needs for energy than I do. So that's my view, but hey, what do I know? I'm just an ornery economist. Thanks a lot.
Before the question and answer period, I need to recognize our corporate sponsors. And our City Club programs would not be possible without the support and generosity of these corporate sponsors. And please join me in thanking our sponsors this quarter, which are the law firm of McEwen Gisvold LLP and Edelman Public Relations. Asking questions is a privilege of City Club members. Please limit your question to 30 seconds and make it a question rather than your own personal economic forecast. And today's first question will be asked by City Club's board host, Ted Kay. Ted Kay is the treasurer of the club. He's vice president of finance at Teledirect International, a technology company, and he earned his MBA at Stanford.
Thank you, Don. I have a question about our state's tax system. Some observers have characterized our tax system as tantamount to hubris, where Oregonians believe that somehow things are different here than in other states. We believe we are so special that we can adequately finance government without a sales tax, with property taxes that have significant limitations, and with an income tax that has shifted the burden away from corporations and toward individuals, and is hobbled by the kicker. How and to what extent would comprehensive tax reform impact the state's economy? Question for each of you.
Well, I'm happy, Ted, you didn't define what comprehensive tax reform meant. But I'm guessing that it probably means something like a institution of a sales tax. But I have to say, given our state and how we feel about a sales tax, we've tried, I don't know how many, I think it's like something like 8 or 9 times to the voters to institute a sales tax. We may have had enough Californians move into the state now where that's possible because they're used to a sales tax. But I think it would be a very hard sell to get it through the state legislature. I've contended that given special interest groups that are out there and lobbying efforts, in terms of who would be impacted by a sales tax, the sales tax that would make it through our state legislature is one that would exempt all sales. Now, having said that, in my position, having to forecast the state general fund tax revenues, and the largest one is the personal income tax. It does tend to be very volatile. An income tax is a much more volatile source of revenue than, say, a sales tax. Having said that, there isn't anything inherently wrong with an income tax. But you have to recognize the animal for what it is, and you need to have solid rainy day funds set aside because of the difficulty it is to forecast it, and anytime you do have a surplus, it goes to the kicker. So that opportunity is closed to you to put that money aside to be used for those rainy days. So how it would dramatically affect, let's just say we did institute a sales tax. My guess is we would probably lower the top marginal rate on the income tax. First instituted as what we would call tax neutral, so there'd be an estimate of what would come in the sales tax, lowering the income tax, so the tax revenues would be about the same as if there was no sales tax. And then moving forward from there, I don't see any real fundamental change in the Oregon economy from a tax reform. You still have the reasons why people are here, and the main reasons are it's transportation reasons, it's energy reasons, it's labor force reasons, your location to your markets. Those are paramount in terms of businesses wanting to operate. Taxes, whether it's a break on taxes or so on, that tends to be icing on the cake rather than the main reason why businesses operate. So I don't see any real fundamental change that would happen. Now, fairness questions, adequacy of providing government services, yes, those issues have to come up. And in my mind, if we do really undertake tax reform, before we do that, we have to step back and take a look at what are the government services that we desire in our state. And then after we decide on that, try to figure out then what is the level of tax adequacy that's necessary to provide those services. And there's always going to be trade-offs, but we just have to face these trade-offs. From that point, then we can start to argue about whether a sales tax would be necessary, income tax, what kind of tax forms we have. One last thing, though, on the corporate income tax, we're in a race with all other states in the U.S. It's a race to the bottom to get rid of corporate income taxes. Given this kind of rivalry between the states, I just think there's a no-win situation on the corporate income tax, and you're going to see it become a smaller percent of overall taxes as time goes on because of this competition between the states.
Let me just make a couple of additional comments. A lot of economists would actually prefer what's called a consumption tax to an income tax, that is to say a comprehensive sales tax. What economists don't like is both, because in essence, if you can prove, as we can, that a consumption tax is approximately the same in its impact on the economy as an income tax, why have both? That's point one. Point two, on the corporate income tax, and this is a broadly held view of economists, is a double tax, because a corporation isn't anything but a paper container through which pass the obligations of employees, management, and shareholders, all of whom are taxed already on the prosperity they enjoy from that corporation. Either whether they receive it as dividends, whether they receive it as salaries, or they receive it in capital gains on stocks or whatever. So it's actually a double tax. And Tom is right. There's not only a national race to the bottom, there's an international race to the bottom, because studies have shown that you enjoy not only greater economic growth, but greater revenues if you get rid of it. Because you essentially increase economic growth, increase incomes, to the point that you actually get more income tax, or you get more tax revenue out of the elevated incomes of the constituents of the corporation than you do by trying to chase the corporation out of town. Ireland has lost some of the companies that moved to it when it had a favored tax rate. to the Czech Republic, for example. It's this happening all over the world. And a very good study that I referred to is done at UC San Diego, measured the impact of changes in corporate tax rates on revenue and economic growth, and both effects are positive. So having said that, I'm glad I don't have Tom's job. I probably just said some things that would make some legislators mad, and I know there are some voodoo dolls down there of me already. So, but nonetheless, that's kind of the economist's mantra. But I agree with Tom that you have to decide what you want in the way of public services first.
Ray Polanyi, a City Club member. First of all, I want to apologize for being late and not having heard Tom Potiowsky's except the last few words, so I'm not really sure. But I have a couple of questions which are addressed to both of you. The first question is, do you as economists accept and agree that economics should be subordinate to the laws of nature? This is the first question. The second question is, do you agree that this is one of the fundamental problems of our times? Thank you.
Well, I'll take a first crack at it. It's a fun question because economists, arrogant suckers that we are, think economics is one of the laws of nature. Competition, interestingly, animals compete for resources. Animals actually learn through a brain that's got a neural network structure not unlike the models we build to model the behavior of an economy. So, God darn it, economics is nature. But I think what the gentleman meant was, should we have economic growth and wealth at the expense of the natural environment? And I think it's inevitable that there are going to be trade-offs. I think it's just a matter of where you stop the trading off. I apologize, I forgot the second part of the question. Tom, maybe you caught it, but
The second part, I think, was just, do you think this is a major issue?
Well, I think it's very hard to determine that balance of just, we keep having children, we keep each one of us producing burdens on the planet, and it's Sophie's choice to decide whether your child is doing well or the snail darter is doing well and so forth. If that's what the gentleman meant, and I'm not sure. I'd trade one of my kids for the snail darter, though, I'll tell you.
Well, I think regardless of, the way I think economics, if you really embrace it and what it tries to look at, it is not a science of dollars and cents. There are many things that we look at in terms of benefit and costs that are very hard to quantify through any sort of market system. And my hope, and I guess the worry, is that I believe that economic forces will work to try to help out the environment. The problem is the timing such? Are things going to actually happen where the environment is, in a sense, destroyed before the actual forces can work themselves out? Because, as you notice, as the world has become more prosperous, the more prosperous the U.S. has become, the more the environmental issues are addressed. Once the rest of the world becomes more prosperous, they also, I believe, will start to address these environmental issues. The fear is whether the timing will be sufficient to be able to have that happen.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. Early on in setting the scene, Dr. Potiowsky mentioned that inflation is low, but as I understand it, when we talk about inflation, we ignore such things as the cost of food and medical care. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. From the point of view of the ordinary citizen who has to survive in this economy, isn't medical care getting much more expensive even though there's not runaway inflation in the way that it's calculated?
Yes, that's a great question about inflation. I made the mention that we're still under 3%, and that is using the overall consumer price index, which includes energy and does include food items into it. Generally, when the economists talk about the core inflation rate, they strip out energy and food, because these are generally very volatile items. I saw a report in the Wall Street Journal where, they say, gasoline prices from the beginning of the year are well up over 60%. Milk prices are up that high. Wheat prices are up that high. And economists are saying inflation's not a problem. And the reporter asked, I wonder if economists drive cars and eat. And you're right in respect that these prices have gone up, and economists always try to look towards the future. What I gave you was present day inflation rates. The worry is that these other prices, staples and so on, work their way through to other prices, and especially when it comes to a point where then workers feel that, boy, my wage isn't going far enough, I have to get wage increases, and to the point that they can do so, firms then pass on those in higher prices, and you get sort of this spiral going that we had, say, in the 1970s. So, yes, inflation is a real worry. And the worry is that it possibly could get worse than we are right now.
I can't add anything to that excellent answer.
Lily Mandel, member. This question is for Dr. Podenza. To what do you attribute that we have lower income in migration than higher income out migration?
Well, a little bit hard to explain, perhaps, but one is that we do have an income tax-based tax system, as Ted prompted us with his question earlier. So as one's income rises, and especially under what's been happening with federal tax policy, the income tax burden rises disproportionately, and so those people ultimately tire of that. When there was a local income tax increment in the region, you may recall, it was in place for a couple of years, I looked at these statistics, and 1,000 families with an average income of $300,000 left the taxing district. They didn't all leave the state, but they left the place where that tax was levied. So partially, ma'am, it's because of tax policy. On the other side, it's probably only natural that the most mobile people in our economy are somewhat younger and poorer. But in the IRS statistics, these appear to be fully formed households, primarily, that are migrating. That suggests that perhaps they're coming here for amenities, perhaps they've been dislocated from other jobs in other economies. There are certainly Californians cashing in on their housing equity. This was the 2005-2006 data that I was giving you, by the way, because the IRS, although it's speedy to get its hand in your pocket, is a little bit slower to give you the information back. So that may have changed a bit there in terms of the California phenomenon. But thank you, very good question.
Sorry. I'm sorry. We're at our timeline. We don't have time for additional questions, unfortunately. Tom and Randy, thank you very much for upholding the annual tradition. It was an excellent program. We'll see you next year.